Rita had been living in her sister's basement for almost 2 years. It wasn't that her sister minded having her there. The problem was that Rita minded. She was 42 years old with 2 kids, and every night she went to sleep on a pull-out couch while her children shared a tiny room meant for storage. This wasn't how she imagined her life would turn out. The divorce had cleaned her out financially. Her ex-husband had been smart about hiding money, and by the time the lawyers finished taking their cut, Rita walked away with barely enough to cover first and last month's rent anywhere decent. But even that money disappeared fast. Her daughter needed braces. Her son had grown out of every piece of clothing he owned. The old car broke down twice in 3 months. Before she knew it, the small settlement was gone and she was back to living paycheck to paycheck. Rita worked at a hardware store during the day and cleaned offices at night. She knew tools. She knew how to fix things. Her father had been a contractor, and from the time she was 8 years old, he'd taken her to job sites. While other kids spent summers at camp, Rita learned how to frame walls, lay tile, and rewire outlets. Her dad used to joke that she had better instincts than half the guys on his crew. Those skills kept her going now. She'd fix leaky faucets for neighbors, patch drywall for friends, install ceiling fans for anyone who'd pay cash. Every dollar went into an old coffee can she kept hidden in her sister's laundry room. She was saving for a deposit on an apartment. At the rate she was going, she figured she'd have enough in maybe 8 months. Maybe. Then one afternoon during her lunch break, she was scrolling through her phone when she saw something that made her stop chewing her sandwich. The city of Saginaw was selling abandoned houses for $500 each. $500. She read it 3 times to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. There were conditions, of course. You had to bring the property up to code within 18 months. You couldn't flip it right away. You had to actually live there or rent it out as affordable housing. Rita's hand started shaking as she clicked through the listings. Most of the houses looked absolutely destroyed. Roofs caved in, windows smashed, front porches that had collapsed into piles of rotting wood. But then she saw one that made her heart skip. It was a 2-story Victorian with a turret on one corner. Sure, the porch was sagging and the yard looked like a jungle, but the bones of the house looked solid. The roof appeared intact. The windows were dirty but not broken. She called the number immediately. A tired-sounding woman at the city planning office answered and explained the program. Saginaw had hundreds of abandoned properties that were costing the city money to maintain. Instead of demolishing them, they were selling them for almost nothing to people willing to renovate them. It was a gamble for everyone involved. The city gambled that someone would actually fix up the eyesore. The buyer gambled that the house wasn't such a disaster that it would drain every penny they had. Rita made an appointment to view the house that same week. She borrowed her sister's car and drove across town to the address. The neighborhood had definitely seen better days. Several houses on the block were boarded up. The corner store had bars on all its windows, but there were also signs of life. A woman was watering flowers in her front yard. Kids were riding bikes on the sidewalk. Someone had painted a colorful mural on the side of an old garage. The Victorian house sat in the middle of the block like a sleeping giant. Rita parked and just stared at it for a moment. The paint was peeling so badly that she couldn't tell what color it had originally been. The front steps were cracked. Weeds had grown up through the porch boards. But something about it called to her. Maybe it was the way the afternoon sun hit the turret windows. Maybe it was the detailed woodwork around the doorframe. Or maybe it was just desperation making her see potential where there was only problems. The city inspector met her there with a key ring that looked like it belonged to a prison guard. He was a heavy-set man named Dale, who'd clearly done this tour many times before. His voice was flat as he recited the warnings. No electricity. No running water. Probably animals living inside. Possible mold. Possible structural damage. He made it very clear that the city wasn't responsible for anything that happened once she signed the papers. They went inside, and Rita's nose was immediately hit with the smell of mildew and decay. The entryway was dark. Wallpaper hung from the walls in long strips. There were leaves and dirt scattered across the floor where rain had blown in through cracks. Dale handed her a flashlight and told her to watch where she stepped. But as Rita moved through the rooms, her contractor's eye started seeing past the damage. The ceilings were high with original crown molding. The floors were hardwood underneath all the dirt and stains. In the living room, there was a fireplace with an ornate mantel that just needed cleaning. The staircase had a beautiful carved banister. The kitchen was a disaster, but it was large with good bones. She went upstairs and found 4 bedrooms. 4 actual bedrooms. Her kids could each have their own space. She could have her own space. There was even a bathroom with one of those old clawfoot tubs. It was disgusting now, covered in grime and rust, but she could already imagine it restored. Dale followed her around without saying much. He'd seen plenty of people get excited about these houses only to walk away once reality set in. When they got back downstairs, he asked her what she thought. Rita stood in the front hallway and did quick math in her head. She had $800 in her coffee can. $500 for the house would leave her $300 for immediate supplies. She'd need to do the work herself to save money. It would take every free hour she had. It would be exhausting. It might even be impossible, but it was a chance. A real chance to own something, to give her kids stability, to stop feeling like a burden on her sister, to prove to herself that she could build something from nothing. She looked at Dale and said she wanted to make an offer. He raised his eyebrows slightly, the first real expression she'd seen on his face. He told her she should think about it for a few days. Sleep on it, maybe get a proper inspection done. Rita shook her head. She had been thinking about having a real home for 2 years. She didn't need a few more days. 3 weeks later, after signing more paperwork than she'd ever seen in her life, Rita stood on the sagging porch with a key in her hand. The key to her house. Her actual house. She'd bought it for $500. She had no idea how she was going to make it livable. She had no idea if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But for the first time in a very long time, Rita felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt hope. Rita spent the first week just cleaning. Not renovating, not fixing anything major, just trying to make the house safe enough to work in. She wore thick gloves and a mask as she hauled out bags of trash that previous squatters had left behind. There were old newspapers from the 90s, fast food containers that had fossilized, clothing so moldy it fell apart when she touched it. She filled an entire dumpster in 3 days. Her kids helped on the weekend. Her daughter Lucy was 15 and complained about everything, but she still showed up with garbage bags and helped clear out the upstairs bedrooms. Her son Kevin was 12 and actually seemed excited about the project. He found an old baseball card in one of the closets and spent an hour looking it up online to see if it was worth anything. It wasn't, but Rita loved seeing him interested in something other than video games. By the end of that first week, you could actually walk through every room without tripping over debris. Rita stood in the living room one evening with her hands on her hips, exhausted but satisfied. The place still looked terrible, but it looked like a house again instead of a garbage dump. She started making lists. She'd always been a list person. It helped her break down overwhelming projects into manageable steps. First priority was making sure the house was structurally sound. Second was getting the plumbing working. Third was electricity. Fourth was everything else. The everything else list was 3 pages long. The bones of the house turned out to be better than she'd hoped. The foundation was solid. The roof had some missing shingles, but no major leaks. The frame was strong. Her father had taught her how to check for these things, and she found herself talking to him in her head as she worked. Telling him what she was finding, asking him what he'd do next. He'd been gone for 5 years now, but she felt closest to him when she had a hammer in her hand. The plumbing was a nightmare, though. Half the pipes had burst during some long-ago winter when the heat was off. She'd have to replace most of them. She couldn't afford to hire a plumber, so she watched YouTube videos late at night after her kids went to sleep. She took notes. She paused and rewound the videos a dozen times to make sure she understood. Then she'd go to the hardware store where she worked and use her employee discount to buy supplies little by little. Her boss Jerry noticed what she was doing. He was an older guy who'd owned the store for 30 years. One day he pulled her aside and told her that if she needed to borrow tools, she could take them home as long as she brought them back. He also started setting aside damaged or returned items that were still usable. A box of tiles with one broken piece, a light fixture with a dented shade, a can of paint in a color someone had custom mixed and then decided they didn't want. He'd sell them to her for next to nothing. Rita worked on the house every spare moment. Before her shift at the hardware store, after cleaning offices at night, all day Saturday and Sunday, her sister kept telling her she needed to rest, that she was going to burn herself out. But Rita couldn't stop. Every pipe she fixed, every wall she patched, every inch of progress felt like she was building a future. She'd been working on the house for about a month when she decided to tackle the dining room. It was one of the worst rooms. The wallpaper was so water-damaged it had turned black in places. The floor had a soft spot near the window where she could feel the boards give when she stepped on them. That soft spot worried her. It meant water damage. It meant she'd probably have to replace some of the subfloor. She started by tearing down the wallpaper. It came off in wet chunks that smelled like mildew and old glue, but underneath she found something unexpected. Hand-painted murals, flowers and birds and vines that wrapped around the entire room. They were faded and water-stained, but someone had clearly spent hours painting them. Rita stood there for a long time just looking at them. She imagined some woman in the 1920s carefully painting each petal, each leaf, making this house beautiful. She took pictures to show her kids. Lucy actually seemed impressed for once. She asked if they could keep the murals somehow. Rita said she'd try, but the water damage was pretty bad. Still, it made her feel connected to the house in a new way. Someone had loved this place once, had made it a home. Next, she started pulling up the damaged floorboards. The soft spot was worse than she'd thought. 3 boards were completely rotted through. She'd need to replace them and probably reinforce the joists underneath. She grabbed her crowbar and started prying up the bad boards. The wood came up easily, too easily. It crumbled in places like wet cardboard. She cleared away the first board, then the second. When she started on the third, her crowbar hit something solid. Not a joist, something else. She pried harder and the rotted board finally came free. She shined her flashlight down into the gap between the floor and the subfloor below. There was something metal down there. A box of some kind. Rita's heart started beating faster. She carefully removed 2 more boards to make the opening bigger. Then she reached down and pulled out a metal box about the size of a shoebox. It was heavy, really heavy. The metal was old and rusty, and there was a simple latch holding it closed. No lock. Her hands were shaking as she carried the box into the kitchen where the light was better. She set it on the counter and just stared at it for a moment. Part of her was afraid to open it. What if it was nothing? What if it was something scary? But curiosity won out. She flipped the latch and lifted the lid. The inside was lined with old fabric that had mostly disintegrated, and sitting on top of that fabric were stacks of old bills. Not modern money. Old currency with different designs. Beneath the money were small cloth bags. Rita opened one and gasped. Jewelry, rings and bracelets and necklaces. Some looked like costume jewelry, but others looked real. Heavy gold. Stones that caught the light. At the bottom of the box were papers. Stock certificates. She didn't know much about stocks, but these looked official. They were dated 1932. They were for something called Blackwell Industrial Manufacturing. Rita sat down hard on the floor. Her mind was racing. Who had hidden this? Why? How long had it been under those floorboards? The house had been abandoned for at least 10 years, but this stuff looked much older than that. The dates on the certificates were from the Great Depression era. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of everything. She didn't touch anything else. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do. Was this legally hers? Did she have to report it? What if someone came looking for it? Her hands were still shaking as she carefully closed the box. Rita had bought this house hoping to find a home. She never expected to find a mystery. And she definitely never expected to find what might be a fortune hidden beneath her dining room floor. She sat there in the empty kitchen with the metal box in front of her, and for the second time since buying this house, she had absolutely no idea what to do next. But this time, the uncertainty felt very different. This time it felt like possibility. Rita didn't sleep that night. The metal box sat on her sister's kitchen table and she kept getting up to look at it, making sure it was real, making sure she hadn't imagined the whole thing. Around 3 a.m, her sister came downstairs in her bathrobe and found Rita sitting there in the dark. They talked for hours. Her sister wanted her to just keep it. Finders keepers, she said. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody had come looking for it in however many decades it had been hidden. But Rita couldn't shake the feeling that this belonged to someone, or at least it had belonged to someone. The question was whether that someone had any family left who might have a claim to it. By the time the sun came up, Rita had made her decision. She was going to call the police. Not because she was noble or trying to be a hero. She called because she was terrified. Terrified that if she kept it and someone found out, she'd lose everything. The house, her kids, her freedom. She'd worked too hard to risk it all over a box she found under her floor. The police came that afternoon. 2 officers who looked just as confused as Rita felt. They took pictures of everything. They made her write out a statement explaining exactly where and when she'd found it. They asked if anyone else knew about it. They put the box in an evidence bag and gave her a receipt. The older officer told her someone from the detective division would be in touch. Rita felt sick watching them drive away with the box. What if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life? What if she'd just handed over something valuable that could have changed everything for her and her kids? But it was too late now. The wheels were in motion. 2 days later, a detective named Morrison showed up at the house. He was younger than Rita expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much. He walked through the dining room and looked at the hole in the floor where she'd found the box. He took more pictures, asked more questions. Then he told her this was going to take some time to sort out. The detective explained that they'd need to trace the history of the house, figure out who might have hidden the box and why, determine if there were any living relatives who could claim it. He also told her something that made her stomach drop. If the items in the box had been stolen, they'd have to be returned to the rightful owners or their descendants. If they couldn't find anyone with a legitimate claim, and if the items weren't stolen, then the property might become hers under something called treasure trove laws. Might. That word haunted her. Might become hers, which meant it also might not. Over the next few weeks, Rita learned more about her house than she ever expected. Detective Morrison called regularly with updates. He'd found property records going back to when the house was built in 1921. The original owner was a man named Theodore Blackwell. That name matched the stock certificates in the box. Blackwell Industrial Manufacturing had been his company. The detective dug deeper. Theodore Blackwell had been wealthy, very wealthy. He'd owned factories, invested in real estate, lived in the biggest house in this neighborhood back when this neighborhood was where rich people lived. But then the Depression hit and things got complicated. In 1933, Blackwell's business partners accused him of embezzling money from the company. Before any charges were filed, he disappeared. Just vanished one day. Nobody ever saw him again. The detective told Rita that people assumed Blackwell had run off with money from the company. The business collapsed. His assets were seized and sold to pay creditors. The house changed hands multiple times over the years. Eventually, the neighborhood declined. The house fell into disrepair and it ended up abandoned until the city took it over for unpaid taxes. Rita listened to all of this while sitting on her sagging porch steps. She asked the obvious question. If Blackwell stole money and ran, why would he hide valuables under his floor and leave them behind? Morrison said that was exactly what made this case interesting. Maybe he'd planned to come back for it. Maybe he'd hidden it before he disappeared. Maybe someone else had hidden it. They just didn't know. The next step was finding out if Blackwell had any living relatives. That's where things got really complicated. Morrison brought in a genealogist, a woman named Patricia, who specialized in tracking down family trees. Patricia was like a detective herself, except instead of crime scenes, she investigated birth certificates and marriage records and census data. It took Patricia 3 months to build out Blackwell's family tree. He'd been married but had no children. His wife had died in 1931, 2 years before he disappeared. He'd had one brother who died in World War I. His parents were long dead. Patricia traced every branch of the family tree looking for cousins, nieces, nephews, anyone who might have a claim. She found distant relatives, but they were so far removed that legally they probably had no standing. During all this waiting, Rita kept working on the house. She had to. The city's deadline was ticking. She had 18 months from purchase to bring the property up to code, and she'd already used up several months. The investigation into the box had slowed her down because the police had asked her not to do any more work in the dining room until they'd finished processing it as a potential crime scene. But she worked on everything else. She replaced all the plumbing. She rewired the electrical. She patched holes in the walls and reinforced weak spots in the floor. She stripped and refinished the hardwood in 3 rooms. Her hands were covered in cuts and calluses. Her back ached constantly, but the house was starting to look like a home. Her kids were adjusting too. Lucy had stopped complaining so much. She'd actually invited a friend over to see the house, showing off the turret room that would become her bedroom. Kevin had made friends with a kid down the street, and they'd been helping Rita haul trash and pull weeds from the yard. On good days, Rita could almost forget about the box and the investigation. Almost. Then the news got out. Rita never figured out how it happened. Maybe someone at the police station talked. Maybe the genealogist mentioned it to someone. However it started, suddenly there were reporters calling her phone. A local news station showed up at her house with cameras. The story was too good to ignore. Woman buys house for $500 and finds hidden treasure. The attention was overwhelming. Rita didn't want to talk to reporters. She didn't want strangers knowing her business. But ignoring them didn't make them go away. The story spread online. People started showing up at the house. Some were just curious. Others had wild theories about what else might be hidden there. A few people even claimed to be related to Theodore Blackwell, hoping to get a piece of whatever was in that box. Detective Morrison told her to be careful. He said treasure hunters were like vultures. They'd heard about one find and assumed there must be more. He suggested she get better locks and maybe a security system. Rita almost laughed. She could barely afford groceries. A security system wasn't happening, but the detective was right to be concerned. One night Rita came home from her cleaning job to find someone had broken into the house. They'd torn up the dining room floor even worse than it already was. They'd pried up boards in other rooms too, looking for more hidden treasure. They hadn't found anything because there wasn't anything else to find. But they'd destroyed hours of her work. Rita sat on her porch that night and cried. Not just about the break-in, about all of it. The exhaustion, the uncertainty, the feeling that finding that box had brought her more problems than solutions. She'd bought this house hoping for a fresh start. Instead, she'd stumbled into a mess that kept getting bigger, and she still had no idea how it was going to end. After the break-in, Rita's neighbors started watching out for her. An older man named Mr. Chen, who lived 3 houses down, began sitting on his porch in the evenings, keeping an eye on things. A woman across the street gave Rita her phone number and told her to call any time, day or night, if she saw anything suspicious. Rita had been so focused on the house that she hadn't really gotten to know her neighbors. Now she realized they'd been watching her all along, watching her work herself to exhaustion, watching her try to build something good in a neighborhood that had seen too much loss. The investigation dragged on. 18 months had passed since Rita found the box. 18 months of waiting, wondering, and working. The genealogist had traced every possible branch of the Blackwell family tree and found no legitimate heirs. Detective Morrison told her they'd also verified that the items in the box hadn't been reported stolen. The jewelry matched pieces that had been listed in Theodore Blackwell's estate inventory from 1933, which meant they'd belonged to him legally. But there was one more complication: the stock certificates. Patricia, the genealogist, had discovered something interesting. Blackwell Industrial Manufacturing didn't exist anymore, but the company had been bought out in 1956 by a larger corporation. That corporation had merged with another company in the 80s. The genealogist had traced the chain of ownership all the way to present day. The company was now called something completely different, but technically, those old stock certificates might still have value. Rita met with a lawyer the city had assigned to help her navigate the legal process. His name was Frank, and he looked like he was about 100 years old. But his mind was sharp. He explained that if the stocks still had value, she'd need to go through a complex process to claim them. It could take months, maybe years, and there was no guarantee she'd actually get anything. The waiting was the hardest part. Rita had put her entire life on hold. She'd continued working on the house because she had to meet the city's deadline. In fact, she'd finished the renovations with 2 weeks to spare. The inspector had come through and approved everything. The house now had working plumbing, updated electrical, a new water heater, reinforced floors, fresh paint, and even some of those original hand-painted murals carefully restored in the dining room. Rita had found a local art student who'd helped her preserve them in exchange for using photos of the work in her portfolio. The house was beautiful. Rita's kids had moved in 3 months earlier, and for the first time in years, they felt like a real family again. Lucy had decorated her turret room with string lights and posters. Kevin had claimed the room with the best view of the backyard. Rita had a bedroom of her own with a door that locked and a window that looked out over the street. She'd stand there sometimes in the morning drinking coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up. But the question of the treasure hung over everything. Rita had spent so much money on the renovations that she was back to being broke. The lawyer Frank had told her not to spend anything or make any big decisions until the legal process was complete. So she just waited, and worked, and tried not to think about what might happen. Then people started coming out of the woodwork claiming to be related to Theodore Blackwell. A man from Ohio showed up with papers that he said proved his grandmother was Blackwell's cousin. A woman from Florida sent certified letters claiming her family had been cheated out of their inheritance when Blackwell disappeared. Even someone from Canada got involved, saying they'd done a DNA test and found a connection to the Blackwell family line. Each claim had to be investigated. Each one meant more delays. Frank the lawyer told Rita this was normal. When money was involved, people suddenly discovered family connections they'd never mentioned before. He said most of these claims would fall apart under scrutiny, but they all had to be checked out anyway. That was the law. Rita was exhausted, not just physically, though her body ached from years of hard labor. She was emotionally drained. She'd wake up in the middle of the night worrying. What if one of these people actually was related to Blackwell? What if she lost everything? The house was hers, but the treasure wasn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Her kids noticed the stress. Lucy, who'd been so resistant to the whole house project at first, now tried to cheer her mother up. She'd cook dinner sometimes, simple things like pasta or grilled cheese, but it meant everything to Rita. Kevin started doing his homework without being asked and kept his room clean. They were trying to help in the only ways they knew how. Detective Morrison called one afternoon with news. They'd finished investigating all the claims. Every single one had been dismissed. The man from Ohio couldn't prove his grandmother was actually related to Blackwell. The woman from Florida had confused two different families with similar names. The person from Canada's DNA test showed they were distantly related to someone with the same last name, but not the same family line. None of them had any legal standing to claim the treasure. Rita felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months, but Frank the lawyer cautioned her. They still had to wait for the formal court ruling. A judge had to officially declare that no heirs existed and that the treasure trove laws applied. That could take another few months. Rita wanted to scream. How much longer could this possibly take? During this time, experts had been evaluating the items from the box. The old currency had collector value because of its age and condition. Some of the bills were rare. The jewelry was authenticated. Most of it was real gold and platinum with genuine stones. One necklace was identified as an Art Deco piece from a famous designer. It alone was worth thousands. But the real surprise was the stock certificates. The lawyer working on that angle discovered that when Blackwell Industrial Manufacturing was bought out in 1956, shareholders of record were supposed to receive shares in the new company. Those shares had split and merged over the decades, but theoretically they still existed. If Rita could prove ownership of the original certificates, she might be entitled to shares in the modern company. The current value was impossible to calculate without going through the whole legal process, but it could be substantial. Rita tried not to get her hopes up. She'd learned that lesson. Every time she thought things were moving forward, another delay happened. Another complication arose. She focused on the things she could control. She'd started helping Mr. Chen fix up his porch. She'd organized a neighborhood cleanup day and a dozen people had shown up to help. She'd even started teaching a basic home repair class at the community center on Saturday mornings. People wanted to learn what she knew. They wanted to fix up their own homes, their own lives. One evening, Rita was sitting on her front porch when a car pulled up. It was Frank the lawyer. He was smiling, which was unusual. Frank didn't smile much. He walked up to her porch with a folder in his hand and sat down on the steps beside her. The court had made its ruling. After 2 years of investigation, verification, and waiting, the judge had declared that Theodore Blackwell had no living heirs. The treasure trove laws applied. Everything in that metal box legally belonged to Rita. Furthermore, the stock certificates were valid, and she was entitled to claim the modern equivalent shares. Frank opened the folder and showed her the appraisal documents. The cash had collector value of about $15,000. The jewelry was worth approximately $45,000, and the stocks, once converted and sold, would be worth roughly $98,000. After taxes and legal fees, Rita would net about $158,000. Rita couldn't breathe. She just stared at the numbers on the paper. $158,000. It wasn't $1 million. It wasn't life-changing money in the way lottery winners talked about. But for Rita, it was everything. It was security. It was breathing room. It was possibility. Frank told her the money would be transferred within 60 days. He stood up to leave, then turned back. He said she'd done the right thing by reporting the find. A lot of people wouldn't have. Rita nodded, not trusting herself to speak. After he drove away, she sat on her porch in the gathering darkness and finally let herself cry. But this time they were different tears. Rita didn't tell anyone about the money at first, not even her kids. She'd learned to be cautious over the past 2 years. She'd seen how people changed when they thought you had something they wanted, so she kept quiet and waited for the money to actually hit her bank account. 60 days, Frank had said. She could wait 60 more days after waiting this long. But keeping that kind of secret was harder than she thought. Every time Lucy complained about needing new shoes or Kevin mentioned wanting to join the school robotics club, Rita had to bite her tongue. Soon she wanted to tell them. Soon you can have those things. Soon everything will be different. But she stayed quiet. The money arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. Rita was getting ready for work when she checked her bank account on her phone, something she rarely did because the balance was usually depressing. But there it was, $158,214. She sat down on her bed and stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. Her first instinct was to quit both her jobs immediately. Just walk away from the hardware store and the night cleaning and never look back. But something stopped her. Maybe it was her father's voice in her head, reminding her that steady work was important. Maybe it was her own fear that the money would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. So she didn't quit. Not yet. Instead, she made a plan. Rita had always been good at plans. She got a notebook and spent an entire evening writing down everything she needed to do. First priority was her kids. Lucy needed a laptop for school. She'd been sharing Rita's old one and it barely worked. Kevin needed supplies for robotics club and some decent clothes that actually fit. Rita wrote down amounts next to each item. Reasonable amounts. She wasn't going to go crazy. Second priority was the house. It was livable now, but there were still things that needed doing. The bathroom upstairs needed a complete renovation. The kitchen needed new cabinets and appliances. The exterior needed proper paint. She got quotes from contractors. This time she could actually hire help instead of doing everything herself. Third priority was savings. Rita opened a college fund for each kid. She didn't put a fortune in them, but enough to make a real difference when the time came. Lucy would be starting to think about college in a couple of years. Kevin wasn't far behind. Rita's father had always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you. Fourth on her list was something she hadn't expected to write down. She wanted to start a business. Not a big business. Something small and manageable. Over the past 2 years, people in the neighborhood had been asking her for help with their houses. Could she fix a leaky roof? Did she know anything about replacing windows? Could she help them figure out what repairs to prioritize? Rita realized there was a need she could fill. People who owned these old houses but couldn't afford regular contractors. People like her. She started researching what it would take. She'd need a license, insurance, a truck, tools. She did the math. She could start small with about $20,000. It was a risk, but it felt like the right kind of risk. The kind her father would have taken. When she finally told her kids about the money, their reactions surprised her. She'd expected them to immediately ask for expensive things. Instead, Lucy cried. She just sat there at the kitchen table and cried. When Rita asked her what was wrong, Lucy said she'd been so worried about her mother. Watching her work herself to death for years. Never sleeping. Always stressed. Lucy said she was just relieved that maybe now her mom could rest. Kevin's reaction was quieter. He asked if this meant they could stay in the house. Really stay, not have to move again. Rita told him yes. They were staying. This was their home. He nodded and went back to his homework, but she saw him smile. Rita kept working at the hardware store but gave notice on the cleaning job. Jerry, her boss at the hardware store, was happy for her when she explained what had happened. He offered to help her get started with her business. He knew suppliers. He knew other contractors who could teach her the licensing process. Within 3 months, Rita had everything in place. She called her business Second Chance Renovations. The name felt right. She'd gotten a second chance with the house. Maybe she could help other people get their second chances too. She started small, just taking on 1 or 2 jobs at a time. Small repairs mostly. Fixing porches. Replacing windows. Nothing she couldn't handle on her own or with one helper. Her first hire was a young guy named Danny, who just graduated high school and couldn't afford college. He reminded Rita of herself at that age. Eager to learn. Good with his hands. Willing to work hard. She paid him a fair wage and taught him everything her father had taught her. How to read a level, how to measure twice and cut once, how to respect the work and the people you're working for. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. Rita's prices were fair, her work was solid, and she understood what it was like to try to maintain an old house on a tight budget. She helped people prioritize, told them what absolutely had to be fixed and what could wait. Sometimes she'd notice a single mother struggling the way she had struggled, and she'd quietly lower her price or throw in extra work for free. The business grew slowly, but steadily. By the end of the first year, Rita had hired 2 more people. She'd bought a used truck with her company name painted on the side. She still worked herself, still got her hands dirty, but now she had help, and she was teaching others. Passing on what she knew. She kept one piece of jewelry from the original treasure, an Art Deco brooch with blue stones. It had been appraised at $3,000, but Rita didn't care about the value. She kept it because it reminded her of something important. Someone had lived in her house almost 100 years ago. Someone had owned beautiful things and had dreams and had faced hard times. Theodore Blackwell had hidden that box for reasons she'd never fully understand. Maybe he'd meant to come back for it. Maybe he'd been protecting it from something. She'd never know. But what she did know was that finding that box had changed her life. Not just because of the money, though that certainly helped. It changed her life because it forced her to be patient. To trust the process. To do the right thing even when it was hard. To believe that good things could happen to people who worked hard and didn't give up. Rita still lived in the house she'd bought for $500. The same house where she'd torn up rotten floorboards and found a fortune. The turret room where Lucy lived had become her daughter's favorite place in the world. The backyard where Kevin and his friends played was green and healthy now. The front porch where Rita sat on summer evenings was solid and level. Sometimes neighbors would stop by and ask her if she ever wondered what else might be hidden in that old house. Maybe there were more boxes under other floorboards. Maybe there were treasures in the walls. Rita would smile and shake her head. She'd found what she was looking for, not under the floorboards but in the work itself. In the house she'd built. In the business she'd created. In the community she'd become part of. The fortune had been nice. The money had given her security and opportunity. But the real treasure was simpler than that. It was coming home every day to a place that was truly hers. It was watching her kids thrive. It was helping other people fix up their homes and their lives. It was knowing that she'd taken something broken and made it whole. Rita had bought a house for $500 hoping to find a home. She'd found that and so much more. She'd found that sometimes the biggest fortunes aren't the ones you dig up from under old floorboards. Sometimes they're the ones you build with your own 2 hands, one board at a time, one day at a time, until suddenly you look around and realize you've built something beautiful, something that lasts, something worth more than money ever could be.